Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the novelist Susan Choi.
We spoke to Susan about working as a fact checker at The New Yorker, the role of literary prizes, and her new novel, Flashlight.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Susan, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show.
Thanks.
We wanted to start with Flashlight. So, as you've said and as you've talked about elsewhere, it began life as a short story. It was published in The New Yorker. And you've said that you didn't have a specific moment where you realised that you felt that there was more to the story that you wanted to expand into a novel. But can you tell us a little bit about how that short story first came to you and then how that process of turning it, reshaping it into a novel kind of took place?
Well, it's more that the short story came into existence after I was already trying to write a novel. And so it's not that the short story came into existence and then I thought, oh, let's expand this. I was really trying to write a book and struggling. I couldn't figure out the approach. I sort of knew the major things I wanted to happen, but couldn't find my way in. And I think the biggest obstacle was, something very important happens to this protagonist. And I was really wedded to that event and could not write it, which, there's probably some sort of connection there. And with the story, I just decided to skip ahead and, I kind of faked myself out. I thought, well, let's just pretend like it's already happened and write that and then, see if you can go backwards. So the story came into existence, like I said, in the midst of this kind of muddled composition process. And, I continued after that trying to write my way around this idea, which mostly involved writing about the individual characters, writing about different points of their lives that kind of fell before or after this big event, as I might put it. And that continued for quite a long time. And by the time I had a very, very large amount of material, I knew it would be a book, but the real struggle was really the structure, trying to figure out what comes first, what comes next, when does the reader learn about the big event, et cetera, et cetera. And that was work that continued quite late into the revision, trying to sort out what order things would go in.
What do you think about the big differences between those two forms, the novel and the short story? I thought it was interesting you commented elsewhere that you initially thought that this would be a short novel, almost of kind of novella scale, and then it's the longest thing that you've done. I mean, from a kind of, watchmaking perspective, making the cogs and the wheels fit together, what is the difference between having a very confined amount of space and then working over a much longer text?
I think at risk of talking down my own book, I think the more confined the spaces that you're working in, the more rigor and discipline you need. And honestly, I think it's harder, at least for me as a writer, the less space I have to, to convey characters to the reader, to snare the reader's investment, make them care, and to create meaning. I mean, that's really what's difficult. And I think the reason I like working in the novel form is it always takes me quite a long time. And I don't just mean like writing time, like composition time, but like just a long time in the world of the story, sort of floundering around in there and poking into different corners and, fleshing out this, fleshing out that, writing stuff that does not get used at all to figure out how to make that meaningful experience for the reader. And short stories are just very, very rigorous, and short novels are, in my opinion, correspondingly rigorous. So my, as yet unachieved aspiration remains to write a really excellent novella. And I have talked about how this book was really quite directly inspired by my experience of reading Jenny Erpenbeck's incredible short novel Visitation and thinking, I want to do this. I want to achieve what she achieves in the amount of space that she achieves it in, which is very, very little. It's an extremely, um, it's just an extremely extraordinary book because it gets so much done in so few pages. And I feel like I've painted myself into a corner here because my book Flashlight is long, and so I certainly hope that in the end it has ended up having its own rigor, and that all of the parts that make up the whole feel really indispensable. But um, I think that in the end, I turned out, just like I always do, to need a bunch of space to tell the story in the way that I wanted to tell it. And I still haven't quite cracked that code of how to do that in much less space. And the story, the story form is, um, I think, a form in which maybe you need to bite off a little bit less at the outset in order to achieve the full potential in that small space, if that makes sense. So with the short story version of Flashlight, I did have, a smaller scale idea that I wanted to be sitting in that child psychologist's office with the young protagonist. But I had laid aside, I was like, okay, all of that other stuff that I really want to explore, I'm not going to try to do it here. And that is why it worked. But I always want to do more stuff, and I think that's why I always end up writing more novels and less stories, although I love stories so much.
I certainly don't think that longer means, flabbier or less precise. So I think
Let's hope not.
I don't think you need to worry there. You've said that you didn't write the book in the way that it kind of appears now as a published, finished product. Did you find yourself following, writing one character strand first and then kind of putting it together with others, or did you, how did you go about crafting the different perspectives and aspects of this story?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that orderly either. It was more like an accumulation. I knew sort of at the outset that the family really mattered. The novel focuses on this small family, mother, a father, a daughter. And so they were important. And I thought, I'm going to write about them. And I knew that this event that affects all three of them profoundly was important. I was going to write about it. But linearity often comes last for me. Not always. I've managed to write some of my books linearly, but not this one. This one was more like a spiral, maybe. And so as I went along, there would keep being new things that mattered. It might be a new character, and then I would write about them for a while, or it might be like a new part of the life of an old character that I'd already written about quite a bit. But, you know, later in the process, I thought, I really actually think I do want to write about the childhood of the father. Initially, I'd thought, like, no, you don't need to. I was trying to be lean, remember? And so I thought, you don't need to go back and give the reader every single thing that a character experienced before we meet them. It's not biography, but then previous stages of these lives would suddenly feel like, oh, that is really relevant. I am going to write about his childhood. And then, in the other example, going along, I would suddenly realize, oh, this other character that I hadn't thought was going to be of major significance, I think they are actually going to matter. And so the book just kept accumulating kind of these like islands of material, if that makes any sense. And at some point, and I've made fun of myself for this in the past, but I'll do it again. At some point, I just couldn't even like find my way through the draft. And I had this, what I felt to be brilliant realization that if I put all of the sections that I'd written into chronological order, um, maybe that would be a good idea. I'd literally not done that. And when I put them into chronological order, it was quite illuminating, So that's like a sign of a very wandering composition process, I guess, that it would have to, strike me as a big innovation to put the sections in order of time.
We always like to get into the kind of mechanics of how books make it into the world. And so having this short story in the New Yorker, I suppose a kind of trailer, as it were, did that help? Was it already under contract from your publisher at that point, or did that help smooth the process of getting them to contract it? How did that sequence of events work?
Oh, very much just as you said, it helped a lot. It was, I mean, very much kind of the peg of the whole sort of presentation, you know. It was, look, Susan's going to write a novel about these people, and you know, how can we prove it to you? She's already written this story. So it was very helpful in that way. That said, I was quite uh worried about putting the book under contract. You know, if you want to get into the weeds, I've written books that were already contracted to be published, and I've written books that weren't already contracted to be published. And although I'm currently under contract to write a book that doesn't exist, um, I will say really honestly that I prefer writing a book that no one's expecting. And I mean, like, literally no one's expecting it. Like, no one's signed me to a contract and given me an advance and said, like, okay, you know, we're expecting that book on or before this date. It's really hard, and there are definitely good reasons to do it and to get under contract, and that's why I've done it. Um, and there are good reasons not to. And so with this book, I was really anxious, even though I already knew so much about the book and had already published the story and had already been writing that whole year in this world. A contract always has a delivery date, and those really freak me out. So I was, um, I was worried that I would fake myself out and just not be able to deliver when I needed to. And yeah, so it's double-edged sword. On the one hand, you know, like, oh, they're expecting it. That can be nice, but it can be terrible.
Just to follow up on a couple of those points. So, is your preferred method to kind of drop a manuscript and be like, here it is? And also, I mean, it's normally about 5 or 6 years between your novels. So, is that kind of method achievable because you support yourself through teaching and through other things? It means you can be working on novels whilst not kind of under contract to do one.
Yes, very much exactly as you said in both cases. Uh, I do really prefer to just write the book kind of in this privacy of not really talking about it or until I'm ready. Not even sometimes necessarily like letting on, until I am really close to being done, mostly because it does take me so long to figure out what's going on. And um, I am a lifelong people pleaser and really want people to like the book. And so I think with a book where I'm kind of at sea and don't know what it's gonna do, I'm kind of cautious as to when I start not just like showing parts of it to very, very trusted people, but even like letting on that there are parts of it to show, because um my own ideas are so unformed that I'm not ready to get a reaction of any kind, even if it's the most supportive, enthusiastic reaction. And so, yeah, I do love to just kind of write a book and then be like, here's what I wrote. You know, maybe you won't like it, but perhaps someone will. The second part of your question also is very astute. That's exactly right. I do, you know, have this very fortunate situation where I teach writing at the university level. And so I'm able to pay the bills, and let the writing kind of unspool as it will without worrying about, you know, an empty refrigerator. I'm really lucky in that way.
And could you tell us about the experience of being shortlisted for the Booker Prize? Congratulations. But also maybe in the context more broadly of prizes and what they've meant in your career. We find it very interesting to talk to people about this, about what the differences prizes make in terms of profile, relationships with publishers and so forth, and maybe comparing where you are with the Booker to winning the National Book Award for Fiction for Trust Exercise.
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm really, uh, the experience of being shortlisted for the Booker is an unfolding one, and I'm not even sure I know how to describe it because I haven't wrapped my own mind around it. I just got my plane tickets to to travel to London, and I'm quite nervous about um the whole thing. It's really exciting and sort of a little nerve-wracking and overwhelming, and I'm thrilled, and also kind of wish I could sit at home and like watch some, you know, uh self-replacement do the whole thing, and I could just like, hear about it later. But all that said, I think prizes are a really tricky part of the writing world. I have to be careful what I say here, because I need to balance like extreme gratitude for being recognized with, an acknowledgement of the fact that these recognitions are really very partial. So in the earlier part of my career, I was, you know, like very much accustomed to this sort of disappointment that comes with award season. I, wasn't nominated for a major award that I had a chance to win until Trust Exercise, which was the fifth book. Um, I'd had this kind of wonderful experience of being shortlisted for a prize that administers itself in this really humane way, as I think of it, where they longlist, they shortlist, they choose the winner, and they don't tell anyone any of it until they're done. And then they call everybody and say, "Congratulations, you were shortlisted for this. We decided to give it to this person, but we're going to bring you down and throw a huge party." And I was like, wow, that is so nice. It was so, as I say, like humane and very, very relaxed. But for the most part, I got to this point in my mid-career where I felt very inured to the awards world. Kind of by design. I just kind of determined that like I wasn't going to get really preoccupied by it, that it was always, this imperfect process. And I remember the fall that my fourth book had come out. I was really proud of it, and I still am really proud of it. I think it's one of my only books that people seem to reliably respond that it's funny. And I'm like very happy to have written a funny book. I plan to try to do that again one of these days. And I was at some big festival here in Brooklyn, and everyone was buzzing about, the short list for whatever it might have been. And I wasn't on the short list. Um, kind of had this whole mental uh, discipline that I created myself, which was like, that's not why I'm doing this. That's not what I expected. I don't feel any less proud of my book. That's great for the people on the short list. Good for them. And so it was like an odd adjustment, actually, to then be shortlisted for a major award and then win it, because I kind of turned myself into this mid-career writer who was very much like, oh, awards are not important. um, and I still really believe that in a fundamental way, awards are kind of like, you know, like you're looking at the totality of contemporary literature at any given moment, like kind of through a straw. And like the things that you discern through the straw are definitely really good because you've pointed the straw very skillfully. And at the same time, there's so much falling outside, the viewfinder of the straw that is just not getting the attention. So as you can see, that was a very long answer. I have really mixed feelings about the whole thing because there's always so much amazing work that isn't getting this huge boost of attention.
That's certainly true. I don't think we've had the straw analogy before. I enjoy it. Could we roll back now to your early life? You grew up in Indiana to a Korean father and an American mother. What role did books play in your early life? And can you remember kind of when you first became enamored with them?
Yeah, they played a huge, huge role. I was not an athletic child. I was, you know, super awkward in any number of ways. And I really don't recall exactly how it started, but my father, who emigrated from Korea and, for him, I mean, English was a second or third language, actually. He really seemed to take on this role of just funneling incredible books into my vicinity. I've actually taken this detail and incorporated it into Flashlight because thinking back on it, I really wish I knew more about what was going on, but I've kind of made some assumptions. I can only assume he must have enlisted the help of like a child's librarian or a teacher or something because this wasn't his world at all. He wasn't a big reader himself. He was a mathematician. Um, living in a country where he wasn't a native speaker. I think he always felt kind of a little sadly alienated from art. He once admitted to me that his dream was to be a filmmaker like Akira Kurosawa, but he didn't feel like that was something he could really pursue in the U.S. as an immigrant, and instead became a mathematician. Which was a language that was like a first language to him. And so I don't know if it was partly that, but my mother was the one who read to me at bedtime, but my father was the one who was really constantly bringing books home, and he brought home incredible books. Lloyd Alexander's series, the Narnia books, Susan Cooper's Darkness is Rising series, which was actually quite new then. I grew up in the 70s, and those books were sort of kind of freshly coming out. They hadn't yet been like canonized as children's lit. Mary Norton's Borrowers series. I mean, here's a lot of there's a lot of British children's literature for you. All the Roald Dahl books in first edition hardcover. I mean, my father really was like building a library for me all the time, and I just devoured these books, like mowed them down. And um, it was extraordinarily important to my development as a person, and it probably to my development as a writer. But I loved to read, and I started very, very bad imitative writing pretty early in this era where I loved these stories so much that I would try to write my own um, truly terrible versions.
And could you then tell us about your experiences at university? So you studied literature at Yale and at Cornell, so moving to the East Coast from Texas. And we saw this nice line that you said you spent time reverently reading bewildering photocopies about post-structuralism. Tell us about that period of your life.
Wow, I couldn't have put it better myself, but it looks like I did. That's that's a pretty great description of what I spent a lot of time doing. It's all self-inflicted, and I don't in any way want to blame these incredible educational, at atmospheres or institutions that I was able to attend. I did go to Yale straight out of kind of suburban Houston, Texas, and where I'd been attending a performing arts school. Not the school depicted in Trust Exercise, but certainly an experience that helped me like envision that atmosphere. But the key point of my high school for these purposes is there just was not a ton of reading going on. And reading kind of um, dropped down to, something that I was doing much less frequently. And I got to Yale and just had no idea what was happening. Like I was really the least prepared Yale student ever. And there was this incredible, very compelling fashion for post-structuralism that was still very much in place at Yale, despite the revelations about Paul de Man, who had sort of been the um, presiding post-structuralist until quite recently, and we were, or at least I was kind of a clueless undergrad, and it was a different time. And I think there was like quite a temporal lag between, say, revelations about Paul de Man's connections to Nazism and, being a black turtleneck wearing student at Yale, like tagging along after Paul Damon's legacy and reading his essays without like any clue that this kind of shadow had fallen across his reputation. So because I didn't know what to study at Yale, and because the coolest seeming people were the people studying post-structuralism, I sort of gravitated in that direction and, put on the black turtleneck and got a pack of cigarettes and started reading Blindness and Insight with not a freaking clue what it was about. And I always sort of mention this. It's a detail that I didn't notice until much later in life. I think that essay is about Percy Shelley, and I had never read Shelley's poetry and didn't even understand that that's what the essay was about. And I remember toiling over a photocopy of that essay in the library with, pencil in hand. And like, what was I even doing? So that kind of set the tone. And then somehow I wrote papers about these ideas that honestly I think were complete gibberish. But I ended up, getting decent grades and going to graduate school, and sort of the same process started all over again. And then at that point, I did achieve slightly greater self-consciousness about what was happening, and ultimately dropped out of my PhD program because I had, again, no idea what I was doing.
Kind of damning that you think that these essays were gibberish and that you still got great marks for them, but fair enough.
My own essays, I mean, who knows? I may have like come out with the decent observation here and there, but judging from how much I've retained, I don't really think I understood much of what I was reading.
I don't think anyone does of post-structuralism, to be fair. Hello, listeners. This is a notice to say that we have once more improved our crowdfunding offerings.
Firstly, we now have a subscription option on Apple Podcasts, where you can hear extra exclusive content from our guests in mini episodes that come out in between the main instalments of the show.
Secondly, on Patreon, we're continuing to offer the bundle of successful journalistic pitches, which goes to anyone who contributes $5 a month or more. You can read pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Economist, The Washington Post, New Scientist, GQ, and the BBC. The whole compendium runs to a whopping 160 pages. Go to patreon.com, that's patreon.com/always take notes to see the full list of publications included in the pack.
Anyone who contributes $10 per month or more now also gains access to the exclusive mini episodes. You can listen for free to a sample mini episode with novelist Lee Child on our Patreon page. At that price point, you also get a signed copy of our book. The first 10 new sign-ups at this level will likewise receive a license to Scrivener worth £55. 7 of those are left. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects, such as novels, non-fiction books, academic papers, and even scripts.
Lastly, anyone who contributes $15 a month or more gets all of these benefits, plus an Always Take Notes mug. They can also join an exclusive monthly call with us to discuss any aspect of their writing lives, including workshopping pitches. All paid Patreons have the opportunity to chat online with other supporters of the show and also to submit questions for upcoming interviews. Once again, you can find all the offers at patreon.com/always take notes. To move on to a different scenario in which you're kind of pencil in hand looking over things, after your MFA you worked for the New Yorker as a fact checker. Tell us about how you came to work there, and also kind of some of the stories you've told of what the sourcing involves in that role.
Oh my God, such a happy time. It was so lucky. I came to work there because I failed to be considered for the job that I thought I wanted, which was assistant to the fiction editor. I didn't know much about how fiction writers should support themselves, and now I kind of understand a little bit better that supporting yourself as an aspiring fiction writer by spending all day long reading the work of other aspiring fiction writers is not the best idea. But I really thought I wanted to do that. I went in to interview for that position. The interview just was a who do you know? And I didn't know anyone. And so I left kind of tail between my legs, feeling like it had gone really, really poorly, and it had. And, called my good friend who had sort of, helped me figure out how to get in for this interview because her brother's girlfriend, all these people are still very dear friends of mine, had a job there. And she said, oh, let's figure this out. And she called her brother's girlfriend and she came back, that person, and said, why don't you go down to the fact checking department and see if they need anybody? And I didn't even know what that was. But I needed a job desperately. I'd moved, I'd made plans to move to New York rather without a plan. And fact checking turned out to be this kind of perfect fit for me as somebody who had stumbled through college, as just described, never really figuring out a proper, program of study. I kind of emerged from college both like a failed post-structuralist and what I still am to this day, which is like a generalist, somebody who kind of like knows a little bit about a bunch of different things, but like does not really know a whole lot about any one thing. I'm still that person. And so that turned out to be the perfect person to be if you wanted to be a fact checker because, every week or so you would be immersed in some article or other, and you'd have to like, take this deep dive into whatever it might be, like Hogan's Heroes or, the Bay of Pigs or like, I don't know. I mean, I'm at a loss for the actual topics, although we could flip back through the magazines. And so having like the capacity and the hunger to kind of dart around learning about different things and then move on was perfect for that job. And it was an amazing time to be there. The New Yorker fact checking department, had its fame as this kind of like place in which accuracy was taken almost to like a quasi religious, absurd level. And we were all sort of proud of it. We were like proud of the fact that when you called somebody and said, this is the New Yorker fact checking department, people would almost uniformly go like, oh, oh, it's you all, the people who ask the strangest, confirmation questions. And everyone seemed to enjoy it together. And it was before the internet really became like the default source of information for everyone and everything. And although I think checking still to this day involves like um, a lot of footwork and a lot of talking to people. At that time, it was all sort of talking, going around, getting books, like actually like looking things up in physical books. Um, and it was just like almost the college education that I hadn't gotten. It was kind of like going back to school again, um, with much greater joy.
We should say for anyone who wants to dive more deeply into that era, we have an episode with Tina Brown as well, where we talk about the New Yorker in the 1990s. Could we now, Susan, turn to your first novel, The Foreign Student, so published in 1998? And as we alluded to earlier on, we love to get into the mechanics of how books are born, so agents, publishing deals, stuff like that. Tell us about how you ushered this one into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I had gone to an MFA program at Cornell and had really, this goes back to our very first topic that we discussed, had really floundered because I was trying very hard to write short stories and um, wasn't that suited to it and couldn't finish the stories. I mean, the stories were like all these fragments, and I was trying to write about my father's immigrant experience in these stories, and the stories never seemed to have any shape, and left grad school sort of feeling quite defeated. And then, while I was working at the New Yorker as a fact checker, nights and weekends, I was still kind of trying to make something out of this material. And I finally understood that maybe it was all wanting to be together in a novel instead of all being separate as stories. Um, and that, that process went on for a while, but it was really invigorated by being a fact checker. There was just something about that slightly oblique relationship to thinking and problem solving and creativity where by day I was, doing all this kind of research for journalists, and then by night and weekends trying to make the fiction happen again, which was really productive. And by the time I finished a draft, I had been at the New Yorker long enough that I could do, you know, the thing that like is totally predictable, but like I would have been an idiot not to do it, which was kind of wander the halls asking for advice. And I remember Alice Quinn, who was then the poetry editor, and a marvelous and brilliant person, and super generous to all of the young people wandering the halls there trying to write their first books. Um, Alice Quinn helped me make contact with some potential agents for this manuscript that I thought was amazing and perfect just because it was finished. One of the agents who agreed to write it, I think probably as a favor to Alice, it must have been, was Binky Urban, who at that time, and I mean, who remains like one of the most legendary agents ever, and who is just sort of this stratospheric figure, up there with Tina, who was, the editor much of the time that I was working at the New Yorker, this person that you didn't really even expect to like be in the elevator with at the same time. And if you were by accident, maybe you'd like run out of the elevator in embarrassment. And Binky Urban agreed to read the manuscript. And then one day my phone, my landline phone, because it was the era of sitting at a desk with a phone sitting on the desk, my phone rang and I picked it up, and this voice said, "This is Binky Urban. I'm going to give you 5 minutes of my time." And I just remember like freaking out and grabbing, a New Yorker memo pad and a pencil with my heart like about to like burst out of my chest. And then she went on to say, "I don't get it. Don't you want to write a good book?" And then she went on to explain to me what was really wrong with my manuscript. And she was completely right. It was kind of astonishing, free, brutal feedback, but it was completely correct. And that was just sort of the end. Like my audition had failed and she was not going to be interested in seeing my work again, at least not this work. But I did go and work on it more. And then eventually managed to find my way to an agent who was much more in my kind of social position of being just starting out and being very eager to have a writer just starting out to help. And the rest is kind of history, but that initial like brutal slapdown by Binky Urban was so formative, for lack of a better word. It was very formative.
I mean, brutal does sound like the word there. How did it take you a while to kind of recover from it and put it into action, or did you kind of immediately think, okay, fine, let's just rework this? Did you feel that she'd kind of, even though the way that she delivered it was pretty forthright, did you feel that she'd hit on something truthful from the outset?
Absolutely. No, she was absolutely right. She was completely correct. And I recognized it. I think it was something that I didn't. I mean, basically, she was like, the book drives off a cliff at the end. There's no ending. You're in such a hurry to be done that you're not done. And this was true. And this is actually like a symptom or a pattern or just a tendency that has plagued me throughout my entire career. I always, to the point now that I have overcorrected, but my tendency is always to think that the book is done before it's done, to think that I found the end before the end has been found, and to the point that in later books I have hung on to them for maybe too long and written maybe too much ending because I was always trying to overcorrect for this, this haste. But I think there was something about being at the New Yorker and being immersed in the real working lives of writers where, I saw very famous, brilliant writers struggle and turn in something that didn't work at all and have to do it again. And I remember this writer that I won't name, but a very, very well-known and brilliant writer and I was the checker for this piece. And the writer was out in the field trying to finish filing, and the editor was in the office. And I won't name the editor either, but the editor picked up the phone to the writer and spoke to that person about what they had turned in so far, and then put the phone down and made eye contact with me because I was standing there waiting for them to give them something else, and said, "He wrote poop." That was her, oh, oops, I gave her gender. That was her response. She said, "He wrote poop." Like, she had basically told him that. Um, there, I've gendered them both, but that still doesn't really tell you who it is. But I think it was being in that workplace environment where these brilliant writers wrote poop on a regular basis, and their editors said, "You know what? That's what this is. Go back, do it again."
And having had that fairly punchy initial feedback, how did you then go about getting a publisher for The Foreign Student?
Well, again, I found this agent who was not, one of the famous agents that I was connected to through the workplace, but who was, uh, brand new starting out agent herself, who I found because she had had a different job with a friend of mine, and they had met crying in the bathroom over how much they hated their workplace. And then she'd left and she'd become a literary agent and gotten in touch with my friend, her sob sister, and said, "I'm looking for young writers to represent if you know anybody." And my friend was like, "Funny, I actually have a friend who just finished her first manuscript and wants an agent." And it was pretty much by the book from there. We met. uh she loved what I'd written. I was thrilled. She went and sent it to a whole bunch of people, many of whom said no. And then I think maybe two of whom said yes. And even at the time, I understood that this was kind of extraordinary, and um, that, you know, it's more like dating, finding the editor who wants to acquire your book, than a lot of other processes. So it just does take one editor. There, it's highly subjective. A lot of editors will say no, it's hurtful and it's sort of disappointing, but it doesn't mean that the book is not worth publishing. It means that it's not for that person. And so, my book was acquired by this one of the two editors who was interested, um, and that was that. And I stayed at that publishing house for the next two.
I wondered if we could talk about how your experience at the New Yorker shaped your approach to research, maybe with reference to your next novel, American Woman, which talks about kind of radical activism inspired by the Symbionese Liberation Army. Do you find, or do you feel that that time that you spent fact checking has shaped the way that you approach research for novels, or do you go about it in your own way?
Yeah, no, I think it did. I mean, I think it did in innumerable ways, mostly because the research that I did for American Woman, so much of it came out of kind of idiosyncratic sources. And I think that I must have really absorbed that from fact checking and from, sort of getting like, as it was then, because it was all very analog, getting like a box of somebody's source material and sort of seeing the different things they'd done. But also, there was an element of making it up as I went along because I was trying to write fiction and not journalism. And so it was a funny process because on the one hand, I wanted total verisimilitude with American Woman. So I wanted to get everything right. I didn't want to get details wrong about the period um, the music on the radio, or, the guns that they were uh, toting around and the ammunition they were putting in the guns, like all that stuff. I think I did partly because of fact checking, and also I think partly because of the kind of reader I am, like the sorts of books I enjoy. I wanted the texture to be totally right. And I sort of knew that the characters, the storyline, their emotional experiences, the decisions that they make, all that stuff was like for me to make up and invent. But like the surrounding um, atmosphere, like I just really needed to know that that was like secure, if that makes sense. Like that, I feel like gave me kind of almost a scaffolding to figure out what the story would be.
Could you tell us about the whole university creative writing world now? So you've taught in that, you've also drawn on it in your fiction, and again, just in our spirit of really getting into the details, like these jobs as you've done at Yale and more recently at Johns Hopkins, how much of your time did it, not just for you but more generally in the field, how much of one's time is taken up for them? How well remunerated are they, if you're happy to speak about that? And I suppose a coda to that is that in the UK, I don't know if it's equivalent in the US, but there's been a real move of creative writing courses being moving, not just being taught by universities, but being set up by literary agencies and now by publishers as well. And there's a kind of big debate about how those have compared. So just could you unpack that whole universe a bit for us?
That's a big topic, and I think that one of the things I have to say at the start is I don't know a whole lot about those courses that are being set up kind of by the industry itself. But I will say that one of the kind of bits of so-called common wisdom when I was coming up as a student was, oh, the US MFA program phenomenon, it always produces like the same kind of work. Like there's this sort of uniformity, and it's stultifying, and I don't know that I agree with that. I actually think that, I would argue that the MFA program in this country is almost more kind of like a harbor for idiosyncratic work and work that isn't necessarily going to succeed in the marketplace. And I think the marketplace is much more um, likely to produce uniform results, right? Because the marketplace wants what sells. And what sells is generally not the most challenging, most idiosyncratic, most unusual literary output. And so, um, while I think as a student of an MFA and, coming out of an MFA later, I had certain reservations or concerns. Like I now am more of a, you know, a booster of it. And not just because I'm employed by it, but because it does seem as if, it's a creative refuge. The university also historically, and this is very, very important, but I think we've only come to really appreciate this right now in this moment, that the university historically is an intellectual refuge and a refuge for freedom of thought. And that is, as you know, extraordinarily threatened, like actively being threatened right now. There are, there are people's lives and careers being ruined, like as I sit here and speak to you, because their academic work or their intellectual work happens not to be politically pleasing. And so I do think that there's an extension into the creative side of it for MFA programs where, um, for all kinds of writing, and not just writing that isn't necessarily commercially viable, but writing that might be not politically viable in this given moment.
With regards to trust exercise, how do you think about genre? I mean, that's a novel that slips between various different kinds. It plays with perspective again, but also, is set in a kind of campus situation, but goes far beyond that. Same is true of trust. The same is true of Flashlight. How do you think about genre? Is it something that you're deliberately trying to toy with as you write, or does it kind of happen as and when you're putting words on the page?
I think it more happens because I don't really think consciously about genre. I think that I'm pretty sort of, you know, dyed in the wool as somebody working like either in or against kind of the realist style of fiction. So either I'm working in realism or I'm kind of like wondering about realism, but I'm not working in another genre entirely. And so I think genre is something that kind of for me like imposes itself at the end. Like once I've written the book, not even me, but readers would look at it and go, "Oh, it's this kind of book." I'm more interested in questions having to do with storytelling and memory and contested truths and sort of the ways in which people are characters kind of understand their lives through narrative. And so like that kind of stuff, if I do kind of succeed in grappling with it in the story, may sometimes like affect the genre distinction that's applied to the story as a whole. But I'm not thinking about that label so much.
We're coming up towards the end of our time. So a final question from me is about AI. So this is something that's been coming up more and more in our discussions on the show over the last year or so, I suppose, with creative writers, but also with publishers and things like that. I know it's a hugely fast-moving landscape, but what do you think about what's coming down the track from generative AI when it comes to fiction writing?
I'm quite paralyzed with terror. And I think my thoughts are paralyzed with terror, like the deer in the headlights. I'm really humbled by the way in which the world defies my understanding. And I think that with AI, I've recognized that it just doesn't really work to sort of like roll out these old cliches about like, oh, nothing will ever replace human creativity. I don't know. Is that the case? If generative AI is trained on human creativity, might it not just replace it? And so I do feel that I don't know. I like profoundly don't know. And I I can't even say more than that, except that it just feels like a radically uncertain time in so many ways. I take half a decade or so to write a book. Half a decade from now is any book that I write going to be wanted or needed? It's really hard for me to say, given like half a decade ago how different the landscape seemed.
I suspect it will be, and I'm not sure that's the note we should end on, but we have run out of time. Thank you so much, Susan, for
Well,
your
let's
time.
hope so.
Yes. Wishing you the very best with Flashlight and all your writing going forward.
Thanks so much. It was a great conversation.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Susan Choi. She's on Instagram at Susan M. Choi. Her website is susanchoi.com, and Flashlight is published by Jonathan Cape. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Susan?
I did spend possibly too much time wondering whether the British edition of her book would be called Torch, not Flashlight. But I don't think that is something that the publishers are concerned about. I thought it was very interesting. I thought particularly this whole world of like creative writing teaching in American universities for novelists, which is such a huge thing, both as what they do to earn money, but also it then becomes the subject of their novels. And we asked her about, her familiarity with this kind of evolving model in the UK where these courses are run by literary agents or publishers, and that's clearly less of a thing in the US. But it's such a kind of ecosystem and part of the world in America that I find it interesting to kind of hear about that. And I also thought the stuff about being a fact checker was really fascinating because I've got a piece which is about to go through New Yorker fact checking, so that's kind of much in mind with me. What about you, Rachel?
Agree, totally. And Susan also wrote an article about her experience as a fact checker, which I highly recommend any interested listeners check out. As I'm sure they could tell, I was fascinated by it. It's sort of New Yorker fact checking is legendary, and she has some stories about it in her piece. So yes, as I say, worth reading. I thought she was a really thoughtful guest, self-deprecating and honest about kind of everything from her early work to her process. And I was interested by the kind of cognitive gymnastics that being a novelist sometimes involves in regards to prizes. She spoke very candidly, I thought, of that thing of trying to convince yourself that prizes don't matter when you're not being considered for them, and then how to manage your feelings once you are being considered for them. So yes, a great conversation, and I highly recommend Susan's novels. We should note that we did record this before the book was announced, so if it's gone out and she's won it, then great. Our timing is perfect.
Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram and TikTok at Always Take Notes. We're on X at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
And we should also say that Always Take Notes is now a co-production with Listening Dog Media.